Hey Seagull class, you learned when you worked with my plate that the food that you eat, when it's nutritious, can give you lots of energy and lots of nutrients. Well, how does your food get those nutrients in the first place? Because when you eat that food, your body takes on the nutrients of that food. Let's take a look. We can learn all about that by looking at something called the food chain. So think of the food in this chain like energy that's being passed along. Because whenever animals are eating or plants are getting their food, they're really getting nutrients and energy. We're going to start here with a group called the producers. The producers are any kind of plant, and producers get their energy from sunlight, water, and soil. Soil holds lots of nutrients and minerals that help feed our producers. Producers might be any kind of fruit or vegetable, leaves, flowers, trees. Any part of the plant and any plant makes their food from sunlight, water, and soil. That's how they get their energy. Now, they're called producers because they're producing their own food, which is different from our next group. The animals in this group, the primary consumers, don't make their own food. They get their energy and their nutrients from the producers. So when these primary consumers eat the producers, they get all of that energy and nutrients that the producers made. Now it's inside of their bodies. But the primary consumers are eaten by secondary consumers. So secondary consumer animals get their nutrients and their energy from the food that they eat, which are the primary consumers. When a secondary consumer eats a primary consumer, it gets all of that nutrients, all of the energy that the primary consumer had in its body now becomes part of the secondary consumer. But that's not where the energy chain stops. Our food chain keeps going because there are animals who eat the secondary consumers. These are called the tertiary consumers, and they get their energy and their nutrients from the food that they eat, which are the animals of the secondary consumer group. So when they eat the secondary consumers, they get all of the nutrients and energy that was trapped in their body now becomes nutrients and energy for the tertiary consumers. And it goes on. Now, nothing will eat a tertiary consumer. The only way that they end up dying is just from natural causes. And so their energy will stay in their body until they die. But once they die, their bodies go back to the ground, and there's something called decomposers. Now, decomposers are things like fungus, algae, bacteria, and a few different insects that you would find in the earth, like millipedes, earthworms, or snails. These decomposers all break down the bodies of animals and plants after they die. And they break down the bodies of animals and plants so that the nutrients is in the soil and can be used by the producers again. So all of the energy that was in all of these bodies of animals and plants that are now dead are broken down into simple nutrients that the producers can use again. And that way, all of the energy is recycled. It goes to the producers, which get eaten by the primary consumers. And then the energy in the primary consumers goes along to the secondary consumers when the secondary consumers eat the primary consumer. that energy is passed along still to the tertiary consumer. Whenever the tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer. And eventually that energy is transferred to the soil as the decomposers decompose dead animals or plants to become nutrients that the soil has now, ready for the producers to pass it along again. Did you know that whenever you eat something, it had all of those levels? Well, that's how your food and how any food that animals eat is made and transfers energy. Now, I have a fun craft for you to do. I made mine out of paper, but you might want to make yours as a drawing first and then to cut it out, because that's the easiest way I found. Now, to make this, you first need to do some research on a food chain. So you have to think about a tertiary consumer. What is an animal that eats an animal that eats another animal that eats a producer? You might have a hard time finding one, but perhaps you don't. If you do, you can just find at least a secondary consumer. But you'll use a flow chart like this, and I'll attach something in the lesson for you to use. And in this first box will be your producer. The energy then goes to a primary consumer, and then it goes to an animal that's a secondary consumer, and maybe you find a tertiary consumer. So first do some research and try and find a tertiary consumer. And if you find one that's interesting to you, figure out what that animal eats that is a secondary consumer. And you can draw those animals in this box. So for my example, I found out that a wild cat, a bobcat, is a tertiary consumer. And it eats foxes. Which is the secondary consumer. Now the fox eats rabbits. And this is what you can do too when you find your animals, when you do your research. The fox eats a rabbit, which is a primary consumer, and rabbits like to eat nice crunchy leaves or crunchy carrots. And so that's my producer. So after you map out your tertiary consumer, your secondary consumer, your primary consumer, and your producer, you can draw the tertiary consumer with its mouth wide open. Now, it's going to look a little different than the regular photograph that you see, because you're going to have to make the mouth part very open, which means his face is not going to be taking up as much of the head as usual. So if this is the mouth, trying to make it as wide as you can, his nose and his eyes are going to have to be up here, his whiskers. But once you get the outline of your tertiary animal and you draw on the mouth as wide as you can put in those details. Then you have to fit your secondary consumer inside of that mouth. Because remember, this tertiary consumer eats the secondary consumer. But you have to make that secondary consumer also have a very wide mouth, as wide as possible. And so his face will end up looking a little bit different than the way you would see it in your research. The easiest way I found to draw these is to look up a picture of the real animal and then try as best you can to think about what it would look like with its mouth really wide open. And then try and add some sharp teeth to show that it's going to eat. Okay, so once you get your secondary consumer, you try and put your primary consumer inside of its mouth. So now you have to try, if you're doing my example, to put a bunny rabbit inside because the fox eats the bunny rabbit. And then you make the bunny rabbit's mouth very big. And I gave my bunny rabbit buck teeth. And of course, the primary consumer eats the producer. So inside we have a little leaf. Now once you have this planned out, if you want, you can do this next step, which is to draw it out on paper and then cut out the pieces. So I have this yellow piece. I used orange paper and then some white paper for parts of the fox. I used brown paper for my bunny rabbit and white for the teeth. And then I used a green piece of paper for the leaf. Now I also used color pencil and some marker for the details. And then on the back I put this pink paper so that from the front it looks like the pink is the inside of each of their mouths. And you can do that as well. This part was pretty hard. Now, in order to cut the mouth part open without having to cut part of the cheek to get it in there, you can do something like this. So see, I have a circle here, and if I don't want to cut around the circle, I just want the circle to be cut out, I can fold my paper gently so that the circle is on both sides of the fold. Then I can cut, just make a small cut on the fold right inside of the circle. So here's my cut. And then when I open the fold, I have this cut inside, and I can take my scissors and put them inside of that little cut that I have. And then I can cut my circle without cutting the sides to get there. And so you can use this technique when you're cutting out the mouths if you choose to do the paper. That way you don't have to cut through the cheek to cut this part of the mouth out. Just be careful of where your hands are when you're cutting, when you're using the scissors, because since you're folding the paper and then you're kind of sticking the scissors in, it can get a little trickier. So be very mindful of where your hands are as you're cutting. I can't wait to see the cool projects that you make up. I hope that you try and do different animals than the ones I do, because I've already seen this example. So now I want to see what other ideas, what other food chains you can come up with besides the bobcat, the fox, the bunny, and the leaf. If you want to do mine as well, you can, but I want to see different examples too, because there are so many chains like this out in nature. I can't wait to see what you come up with.